Hey everybody, my name is Michael McDowell. Great to be with you. Today we're talking a little bit about how do we develop students' dispositions to become their own learners over time. And we're going to be doing that by focusing on small, doable habits that students can do to help them be able to do a couple of things. One is to be able to engage in their own metacognition. Ne- Think of it as like a learning GPS, students knowing where they're going in their learning, where they are, what's next. How do they navigate challenge? How do they handle setbacks, different perspectives, challenging opinions? How do they, the third one is how do they work together? How do they work with each other to solve complex problems? And then finally, how do they consolidate learning? How do they make sure that they take time to reflect, take time to practice, and get better at getting better? And all of this has to do with this notion of learning how to learn. And these are dispositional habits. You can see in this particular image here, a teacher is working with students on being able to calibrate where a particular work sample is across different success criteria so that students can then be able to use that to self-assess their own work, but also to give each other effective feedback as well. So let's jump in. I love this image. This is from a professor named Guy Claxton. He's written a number of books, and he talks about the learning river. And he talks about how when we think about currents in a river, the currents at the top of a river flow much faster than those down at the bottom of a river. And so when you think about developing students' knowledge, developing their skills, and that they're becoming literate, that travels a little bit faster than developing those attitudes and dispositions to becoming your own learner. This is a lifelong pursuit. So when we think about this with our students, we need to think about this as slow and steady wins the race, that we just build a little bit over time. And we don't think about how do we tick the box for metacognition in year 3. I think this is really about slowing down and saying, how do I just get my students a little bit better in being metacognitive? I mean, think about those of you who are watching this video right now. You're continuing to develop these skills and dispositions and attitudes over time. So for those of you who've been watching the other videos, we have a framework. That framework is centered around 10 key habits. We have 4 that are dispositional habits, and we have 6 that are competency-based habits. Today, we're going to really narrow in on those 4 habits on the left. And if you have some stickers or some colored pencils, you can self-assess where you think you and your students are. Again, if you come back here, green, you routinely engage in this habit with students. Yellow, you do it sometimes. Red, either you are displaying it, but that's not necessarily in action with students, or you might be doing it, but students are not necessarily doing it. We would put a red dot there just to say that's a place that we might need to work on. So today we're going to look at what are those 4 habits, and what are some small doable routines that I can make those habits sustainable over time. When you plan for any implementation, these are your 6 criteria to consider. Number 1, make sure it's manageable. Start small. I'm going to show 6 practices. Don't pick all 6. You might pick one. Whatever you pick, make sure that you think that that could be something that would be routine that you can do every day. It can't be metacognitive Thursdays. It's got to be, I could do this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Number 3, make sure that you link it to something you already do. It needs to stack onto your current practices. So is this right when you welcome students into the class? Is this when you're transitioning from one activity to another? Is this when you do an exit ticket? Make sure that you stack it to all the great things you're already doing. Number 4, don't add more. So if you're watching this video and you pick one practice, don't go to the next video and pick another practice and another practice. Just stay small, stay focused, pick a practice, work on that. And then test your idea with a small sample. This might be a small group of students in your class, or if you're in a middle school or a high school class, you might say, I'm going to just pick one class period to work on this for a few weeks, just so that you can test it out. How well is it working for you? How well is it working for your students? And then you can start looking at the issue of how do I then scale this over time? And then make sure that you have somebody that you can share your impact with, that, hey, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, and here's how I've been assessing that. I think the more that you actually are inspecting your impact, the better chance that as you continue to do this work, you'll be able to detect the small differences and improvement over time. And I think that's such a critical part of our work, of being able to have efficacy in our work and sticking to certain practices. So let's jump in. So we're going to look at engaging in metacognition. This is a student's ability to be able to be assessment capable. They know where they're going in their learning, where they are now, what's next. And a couple of practices that can really help with that is using a protocol called the silent protocol. The silent protocol is a wonderful way to help students develop clarity of what they're learning by them having to put in a little bit of effort in establishing that level of clarity. Often when we have students work on clarity, we do all the work for them. We make really clear learning intentions, really clear success criteria. We put it all over the walls. We share this with them. And what happens is they're watching us work. So they're not having to put in the effort. And in all of my research and all of the practices that I've seen in schools, what's really, really important is that students have to work for their clarity. They have to earn it. So a way of thinking about this is you have to make sure kids live clarity, not that we have to laminate it. So let's look at these 4 practices or 4 steps around this practice. So the first step is that we really want to share the learning intentions with students. We want to tell them that they're going to work in pairs to figure out what the success criteria will be as you demonstrate an example on the board. Share with them that you will show them an example, but you're not going to talk. So an example could be you'll say to them, we're learning how to add fractions with common denominators, and then show them an example of the first criteria of the board. So you actually write out the first step, and then don't say anything, and then have students work in pairs to check their work. So together, so the teacher might write down, 1/4 plus 1/4 equals, they're not saying this obviously, and then the students are writing down what they think the first step might be. Step 3 is to then do some random checks to determine similarities and differences between what students thought you did in that first step. And then you're actually going to share out what you actually did. So the students can say, okay, I thought you did this, but you actually did this. Step 4 is then to repeat that. So then you do that with all of the steps. So you write the step down, completely silent, have the students write down the success, talk about and write down the success criteria. You check theirs, then show them the actual success criteria and say, how is that similar? How is that different? This is a really nice protocol to help students develop that level of clarity. Another one is what we call learning GPS clues. So provide students with the learning intention, the success criteria, and a context. So you might say something like, we're going to be learning about food chains, we're going to be learning about food webs, and we're going to be looking at that through wolves. As soon as you do that, ask the students, hey, what are you learning? And what are you learning that content through? We're really trying to get students to say, I'm learning about food chains and food webs. I'm learning it through the study of wolves. Then provide students with their pre-assessment results. So you give them an assessment and then ask students to determine the gap between their current understanding and the end of unit goals so that they actually see the gap. This is what we would call students being able to say, I know where I need to go and I know where I am now. And then you get to step 3, which is what's next. This is where students can work in pairs to kind of plot out, okay, this is the next step that I'm going to take to improve. Have model steps presented for students and then monitor the classroom, asking questions for students to ensure that the next step is doable. And then finally, we go into a check-in. So using a fishbowl protocol, so you might get a small group in the middle of the class and then another group, and then the rest of the class is outside. Ask them to go through that. So ask them to say, hey, where are you going? Where are you? What do you think is next? And provide questions and a little bit of corrective feedback to make sure that they're calibrating where they're going, where they are, and what's next. So that's the learning GPS. In terms of navigating challenge, a couple of things that we can do. We're really trying to help students be able to separate their ego from the actual work in place. So how do you separate your identity from feedback and the ideas that you're receiving in terms of feedback? And zones of learning are a really helpful way of doing this. So one thing that you can do to start to practice this is you can create kind of a red, yellow, green kind of schema. And you could give students like some circles that are red, yellow, green, or you could, if you don't want to use red, yellow, green, you could do a 1, 2, 3. You could put something on the wall that actually shows the different colors. And what you want to talk to them about is that yellow is what we would call the learning zone. This is where we want to be. There's kind of this cognitive wobble. Red is we feel in defense mode. So we feel very uncomfortable. So we don't know enough. We're overwhelmed. Our identity is now at place. And green is like, I already know this. I feel super confident in doing what I'm doing. So the way to start this is present a content-based question and ask students to determine if their zone is taking the majority of which zone is taking the majority of their time. And it could be the learning zone, so the yellow; performance zone, which would be green; and then the defense zone, which is I feel overwhelmed. And then the next part is to share that each zone is a part of our thinking all the time. I think it's really important that they know that one is not bad or good. They all have benefits, but we need to make sure that we know when we're supposed to use certain types of thinking, which zone we should be in at certain times. Ask students to share in pairs which mode is important to express when they're trying to solve a problem in class. Hopefully we see that students are working on that yellow zone, or that learning zone, when we're in practice, and then likely in the green zone when we're taking tests and when we're taking quizzes, that's the time to perform. Then let's use a think aloud to share what students could do to stay in or move to that learning zone when we're in practice, and then have students show those ideas out. And to me, I think this can be a really helpful process to doing that. Another protocol that's really helpful, and I think you could put this either in that engaging metacognition or here in navigating challenge, is the work sample protocol. One way to do this is share an exemplar work sample with students, ask them to identify the learning intention and the success criteria. So tell them right up front, hey, this is a successful piece to me. And then say, I want you to see if you can identify what you think we might be learning about and what success looks like. As soon as they do that and they talk about that and write that down, share the learning intention and the first success criteria. So students should compare and contrast their drafted learning intention and success criteria with the actual rubric. Next, we want to repeat step 2. So, and I want you to go through the entire work sample. So read the work sample, share an important success criteria, and show its location to students. And then have students compare and contrast their original success criteria with yours. And then finally, repeat this process again with a brand new work sample. Start with showing an example in the paper and asking, what criteria does this meet? Next, switch and show a criteria and ask students to find the example in the paper. I think the more we do this, the better students will be able to have clarity of what they're learning, be able to be more assessment capable. And then when they're receiving feedback, they'll actually be able to navigate that challenge because they know that you're talking about the criteria and not about them. Let's talk about working with others. One really nice protocol to help when students are working with each other and giving each other feedback or looking at evidence is to do what's called a what, so what, now what protocol. The way that this works is a what protocol is, so the first part that we would start with is what is all about facts. So we're not making inferences, stories, we're not suggesting next steps. So the first thing we might do is provide students with a piece of work and success criteria. Ask students to write down only factual information on which success criteria has been met or missing in the work sample. For example, there are 3 run-on sentences, 4 of 6 problems are missing a rationale for the answer. Those could all be examples. And this is really, really helpful when students are working in groups, because if they're looking for feedback, if they're looking for suggestions, what we want to always start with are the facts. So teams are going to work and be like, you know what, let's just figure out what's the what first. Next, we actually go to inferences. So this is the so what. So prompt students to write or publicly share a summary statement of what pattern or stories emerge. There's usually multiple stories, which is important. This should be a story about the implications of the feedback. So this piece has a number of run-on sentences, which will prevent the audience from understanding the ideas in the paper, right? That's a story, that's an inference. If work is not shown, then it will be difficult for others to follow the logic of the author in solving the problem. Then we get into step 3, which is now what? Now what should we do based on this? So prompt students to generate 3 next steps they would recommend to improve the work sample, and they should share the next steps with a peer and then with the class. Finally, students should then start to work with each other's work sample. So to say, okay, let's do that same process. What, so what, now what? What are the facts? What are the implications? And then what are suggested next steps? Finally, we're going to look at consolidating learning. And this is really about helping students be able to reflect, to be able to refine their understanding and their experiences over the last X number of minutes or days. One really easy way to do this is what's called I used to think and now I think. So have students review their know and need to know list. So this is a protocol with like, what do they know and what do they need to know? So from the beginning to the end of the period, when they get to the end, have them review it. Like, what do you know? What do you need to know? And this is really important. This can be done individually, in pairs. They could and should be. I would suggest that you actually have this written out. Next, ask students to review their own notes or previous assessments and determine how you know that this idea was what you used to think. So this is what I used to think. This is my prior knowledge, and I have evidence of that. Now ask students to write down changes they have made in their thinking over time. So now I think this. So I used to think this, and now I think this. And then ask students to work in pairs and discuss the changes in the learning. What was the big shift for you? What changed? And there's some suggested questions here that can help you out with that. So these are just a couple of protocols that you can use to really help students develop those dispositions over time. And I'm a huge fan of creating some set plays. So setting it up, trying it out, doing this in a role play, doing this in a class and say, look, we're going to try this. And when you do a set play, you really want to be able to say, okay, what's my action? What's the student's action? What's the actual task that students are going to be working on? And really writing it out, talking through it with colleagues to really set up that set play. There's a couple of ways that you can do this. These are 4 kind of steps to consider. So start with the explanation of any of these protocols. So just like what I did. So how does this practice connect to the habits that you want and the evidence you're going to collect? How do you outline each of the steps? Where are you going to place it? Demo, model this, practice this. How's this a little bit different from what you do? And then embed it in your lesson. Pick a date, a time, and a class to implement, and then do it, and then debrief, and then repeat. And I think by doing that, you'll find that your students over time are developing stronger dispositions. Thanks, everybody. Bye.